In order to secure an operating system, well, you have to know a little bit about it. And if you're unfamiliar with Linux, then stay tuned.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Well, we captured your imagination and you stuck around. I'm so happy. We're talking about Linux today. And, well, Daniel, I say we just go ahead and ask the question, why would we care about Linux?
It's a pretty good question. It's a valid one. I'll give you that. And that's because if you're working in security or if you're just working in IT in general, odds are you're eventually going to run across a Linux system from time to time. If you're unfamiliar with those systems, you're going to have a hard time interacting with it. And if you're doing security, you're going to have a hard time securing it. So having some basic knowledge of Linux and how it works and some of the very basic security things that we can do to that system would be beneficial. So that's why we're looking at in today's show.
All right, well, Daniel, I guess in order to get familiar so we can lock things up, tighten them up, or at least know what we're looking at when we open a system, where are we starting?
Let's start with the file structure itself. The structure inside of a Linux system is very uniform. You're going to see not a lot of change throughout systems, so it helps us to kind of understand what's going on, some of the common things that we might need to be familiar with. So let's go into my Linux system here, and I will show you what I mean. If I do the command ls, what that does is list all the files right there. But just like in a Windows system, we have a hierarchical directory. Well, it's not so much hierarchical. It's based off of one major area, which is what's called the root. And I can get there by going cd /. That / is the root directory. It is the directory that holds them all, okay? And then once I do that, and I do an ls, you'll see that I'm seeing a bunch of different stuff here. Now, if you've never been in the root directory of a Linux system, this is you're probably looking at this going, what is going on? This is craziness. But there are some very common things in here that you will see in just about any Linux system. One of them is going to be things like the boot directory, the bin directory, the dev directory, etc, home. Let's see, what else? The mnt or mount directory, you probably see that quite often. Opt is usually there, proc, root, which is the root user's home directory. And having some passing familiarity with what some of these directories are for can kind of help you out with these things. Let's take var, for example. var has various things in it. Isn't it a great, that was some primo labeling of a directory. But inside there, we typically find things like log files. We typically find web server configurations. Or if I have the files for my website, they're going to typically be found underneath var in another directory, and sometimes another directory, and so on and so forth. But that's where those things will live. And we can see that. So if I cd into /var, I do an ls, you'll see I've got this www directory. That www directory is there because I'm running an Apache web server on this system, and that's where it's going to put those files that Apache is going to look for by default, right? What else do we have in here? Again, the log file, also really good one for us to be familiar with, that is stuck in the var directory. So if I cd into log, ls, I'm seeing all the log files for this system, okay? Let's go back to root, the root directory, back to root, not the root directory. That can be confusing, Justin. You ever got caught with that one?
Yeah, it's you're like, well, go to the root. Wait a minute, not slash, not the beginning.
/root.
So in this case, slash is the root of things.
Correct.
But think of it as like the root of a plant. It's where all things begin.
Good place.
Right.
Good way to put it. I like that.
But then the root folder is like a leaf of the plant
for a user called root,
which more than likely you are not. It just so happens that Daniel's using a Kali box, which the default, which they're changing.
I think they've already released it. It has changed as of the filming of this episode. But yes, I'm logged in as the root user, so I can access that. I have that folder available for us. Let's go back to the root. It looks like I already did. Do an ls. Another one I want you to be familiar with is etc. Very important one. If you cd into /etc, there's most of our configuration files are going to reside here, as well as things like starting up the machine. The actual scripts that run when the machine boots will typically be found in Etsy somewhere. We also have a couple other files we'll take a look at as we move through this episode. We'll get to them, which is the Etsy password file, Etsy shadow, a lot of good stuff in Etsy. So if you're looking for a config file, chances are it might be found here in Etsy. That's where we see this stuff. Having anything to do with services, things of that nature, Etsy is a great place to look for that.
Now, Daniel, I know you're moving around with relative ease. You're like, I do what I want.
I've been here before.
Yeah, everywhere. However, if I'm logged in as a normal user, or maybe even as a service account user, there's a possibility that I'm not going to be able to get into here, right?
That is a good possibility. Now, you might be able to get in here, but you might not be able to do anything once you're there. And then sometimes you might run into that, hey, permission denied. You're not going any farther there, buddy. And that's what we need to get into next. It's going to be permissions. When we're working with files and directories inside of a Linux operating system, there are permissions that allow us to do certain things. Typically, those things include reading, writing, or executing a file. Okay? Those are the standard permissions that we would want to work with or see. And we can take a look at those. I'm going to go back to, let's see here. Let's go to the root. Let's go to my home folder, which is right here. If I do, let's see here. What do I want to do? Let's go into the tools directory. That is a directory I've created. It has all my fun little tools and stuff that I do for things like penetration testing. But if I do an ls-l, that's not how you do it, ls-l, it will do a long list format and show me whether or not it's a directory or a file, and also what the permissions that are associated with each one of those objects are. So I hit enter, you start to see this. Now, that information resides over here on your left side of the screen. You'll see here with Silent Trinity. These are the permissions for Silent Trinity. That which is a directory, which we can see at the very far left, it has a D, letting me know that is a directory. Okay, that's great. And then I have RWX. So RWX are representing the read, write, and execute functions. And then you'll notice it kind of repeats itself, or there's a dash, right? So with this one, we have RWX, then R-X, then R-X. So this shows us the three fields of which we need to concern ourselves with when it comes to permissions inside of the Linux operating system. So what we have is the first set of RWXs, which is this one right here. And I'll zoom in just a bit, give us a little more focus on that. So there you go. That is the owner of the object's permission. So we can see the owner right here is root, and the group ownership is also root. So that's what these fields are for right here. We'll get a little more into that in just a second. But since that is the owner, which is root, that is root's permissions. As we move over, we have this set. We have R and X, which means we have read and execute permissions on this folder for anybody in the root group. Following with me so far? Then we move over again. The dash means that that permission is not set. There's nothing there, which means you don't have it. Okay. Then we move again, R and R-X, which is for others. Any other user or group on the system, they're going to get those permissions, which is read and execute as well. And of course, I can change that. We see down below, this file has R-dash, which means the other group only has read permissions, as well as anybody in this group, right? So those are the important fields that we need to be concerned with when it comes to setting permissions. Now we need to know, how do we do that? How do we set those permissions? How do I make those changes? To make that change, we use a command called chmod, or I think it's short for change modifier or something to that effect. Always have a good time with your man file if you want specific information detailed down to the minute structure. They're always very helpful with that. But when we're doing chmod, what I want to say is I want to change the permissions of this object to this. You can do this one of two ways. I'm going to tell you Justin's favorite way, which is using the numerical system, and then we'll take a look at the symbolic. He's shaking his head.
I will tell you. So the numerical system can be very powerful.
Yes.
But it's a good way to go, hey, I just removed my own permissions. I can't do anything now, and I need help, right?
And I think you're going to see that here real quick because, Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, it's more complex than it seems like it needs to be. But this is the way it originally was set up, so It's what we have to live with.
And you'll get used to them eventually. Like after you do it for a while, you go, oh yeah, that is a.
Well, you see some common ones over and over and over again. So you go, oh, I know what that means just by looking at it.
Yep.
Right? But basically what it boils down to is you have a few bit numbers, right? It's a set number for a set bit which turns on or off a permission, right? And these numbers are 4, 2, and 1, okay? And if you add them together, they create a set of permissions. So if I have 1, that's going to be execute. So if I set the 1 bit, so if I do chmod 1 or just like 001 or 711 or whatever, right? That 1 bit in that third position is going to be just that 1 bit is going to be the execute permission. The 2 is going to be write, I believe, yes, and 4 is read. So if I set 444, that means read permission for owner, read permission for owner group, and read permission for other, right? So 444. If I set 411, that would be read permission for the owner, execute permission for group, and execute permission for other, right? So that's how you see this. I'll show you what I mean. So let's create a file. I'm going to get out of here. I'll go into my test directory, so that's where I go to mess with stuff. And we'll create a file. We'll touch file 1. So now I can do ls-l on file 1, and we see we have some standard permissions already set. Read, write, read, and read, right? We're good to go. But I want to change those permissions. I'll say chmod, and I'll change it to 755, which is a very common set of permissions that you'll see. You're like, oh, you didn't say anything about 7s or 5s, Daniel. What the heck is going on here? Yeah, it's math time. And Justin, you're good at, hey, he's clapping like a harp seal. Having a great time, right? What that means is like, if I have 7, that means I have read, write, and execute, because 4 plus 2 plus 1 is 7. So that's telling the machine that I want all of those bits. If it was 6, that would be 4 and 2, because you can't make 6 out of 4 and 1, right? Or 2 and 1. Doesn't work. So whatever that works out to, that tells you what your permissions are. So with 4, 2, and 1, I get 7. If I want 6, it's going to be 4 and 2, so it's going to be read and write, so on and so forth. You get the idea. So I'll set it to 755 on file 1, and now if I do an ls-l on file 1, we can see that it now has read, write, and execute for root, read and execute for, because it was a 5, right? What's a 5? It's a 4 and a 1. That's read and execute. You get the idea. You also probably are getting the idea that this is extremely complex, or a little more complex than you'd like it to be, just to set some stinking permissions. You got to memorize all these bits, and if only there was a better way.
And here's the kicker. If I need to, something that messes me up, if I need to set the executable bit on a file that already exists, but I want to maintain the remaining permissions, then I go, wait a minute.
Yeah,
so it
it's
has
math
read,
time.
write. So it was a 6. Now, okay, I need to make that a 7.
Right.
So you have to be careful, because I was just alluding to, whoops, I removed my capability of looking at that. If you don't do the math right, you lock yourself out, you lock a group out, whatever it may be.
Seen it
things
1,000 times.
Things go horribly awry.
Yeah, it's a real quick way to get yourself in the weeds, which we want to avoid. And because that was such a common practice, they did come up with another method, which they call the symbolic method, which is way easier, right? So we'll clear the screen here. Oh, not Cladar.
Cladar.
Yeah, Cladar. What we can do is same thing, chmod, but this time we have symbols that we can use. We have U, G, and O, and R, W, and X. We use an equal sign, a plus sign, and a minus sign. This is the basics of it, right? So U, G, and O, user, which is the owner, group for G, O for other, any other person, right? Then we have R, W, X. Well, we kind of figured that out, right? Read, write, and execute. Then plus, I want to add this permission to this file. So maybe I'm doing O plus X. I've now made it executable for anybody that's not the owner or in the owner group. What if I do U equals RX? That means set the permissions to read and execute for the user that created the file, right? Let's see what I mean. I'll show you. So if I do chmod and I say, I'll say U equals RWX and file 1. Bing. ls-l on file 1. and you'll see it's RWX. Oh, you know what? I don't need execute, so let's change that. I'll say, I can do it one of two ways. I could chmod u equals R, and what do we want? W? Yeah, I could do that. Or I could say minus execute. So that would remove that execute permission. Just depends on how you want to work with it and what you get comfortable doing or the circumstance. So I can also do a comma and do go equals RW. Oh, equals, not minus. RW. And then you just tell it the file name, file1. And it will set all these permissions. If I go there, then I do an ls-l for file1, I'm seeing the set permissions that we just made. Pretty straightforward, much easier to work with than what we saw with that numerical system.
Now, Daniel, I've run into this. There are times where I've downloaded a file and things went horribly awry because it says, you are not the owner of this file. I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I thought I was the owner of this file. And it goes, no.
Nah.
So you don't have the permissions.
Yeah.
Now, I could change the permissions, but then I've run into times where I'm like trying to build a web server and I do need to change the ownership for consistency. How do I do that?
Yeah, I've run into that as well, specifically within doing web stuff. A lot of times when you work with service accounts, things of that nature, I need the service to be able to do whatever it needs to do. And it's just easier to give it ownership of all those files than it is to try to set a bunch of permissions, right? So what you do is you can use the chown command. Do it like this, chown. And if I wanted to change the owner to, I don't think I have anything else on. Well, I guess I could use www.data. Chown, I say www/data, so I'm giving the web server access to this. They're going to be the owner of this file. Then if I do a colon, www-data, I'm also now changing the group ownership as well as I go along with that. And then just say file1. If I do an ls-l on file1, you now see that it went from root to www.data as the owner and the group owner of that specific file. So there you go. That's how you change ownership. It's a real quick, easy thing to do.
Now, Daniel, changing ownerships, I have to be honest, I've changed ownership of a folder, and then I'm like, oh, I need to go back in it. Well, wait a minute. Or web servers, my favorite, var log. And I'm like, I need to look at I don't have permissions to look at the logs. So can you tell us a little bit about like how this affects access and things?
This can definitely affect access as far as the ownership goes if you don't have those permissions. So you might need to do some change of ownership. You might have to add a permission or two. But we also need to talk about access to the system. We're starting to get far down the road. Let's just start at the beginning of access. Like, how do I access the system? How did I get here to be able to type stuff in? Well, you have a login, right? That's the first way to access the file or the system itself. Now, when I log in, it's typically going to ask me for a username and password, and we're talking security here, right? So what's a username? Where's that stored? And the password, where's that stored? Well, let's take a look at that. Remember that Etsy directory we talked about earlier? If I take a look in Etsy, if I cat this file called etsy/password, if you remember, it's WD. If you remember, I mentioned this earlier. And these are all the users that is on this system, okay? And you'll notice I don't have any real users going on here. I mean, I have some, but they're mostly service accounts, but no login users. I have one, which is me, which is root. If I go over to this machine, though, I have a couple of users. I can cat/etsy/password. And I should have my own, which is right here. I've got service accounts for MySQL. I also have root up here as well. So that's where they go. But we also have passwords associated with them. That's the Etsy shadow file. Now watch this. This is going to be fun, right? If I say cat/etsy/shadow, look at that. I get that permission denied. That is a very sensitive file because it contains the hashed password. And if I can get a copy of that, I can attempt to break that hashing algorithm or break the password, brute force it, and see if I can't come up with the password and then be able to access the system with a bad way. So you want to make sure that stays locked down. But it's a very important file. That's where that comes. I can sudo this, which we'll talk about in just a second. And I have to type in my password. And now you're seeing there is the hashed password right there. So that's how the system knows whether or not my password was correct and whether or not my user account was even in the system. 2 files you need to be aware of. Let's see, anything else? .ssh, you might not be logging in with using a username and password. If you're accessing through SSH, which is a secure shell, which is a very good practice to do because it is secure, you might find a file, ls/.ssh, right? Does not access. Let me ls-al, which will show me hidden files. You notice it starts with a dot. I don't have one here. I might have one over here though. Let's take a look. Go back home and ls-al dot. I don't have one. Oh, there it is.
Right there.
Bing, 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 bing. There we go. So now I can cd to .ssh, and inside of there I have known hosts. I can also hold my public keys and private keys in there. So if I want to log in using keys, I can do that. Harken back to our old cryptography episode where we talked about public and private keys. If I've got a key there, I can use that to log in because it will authenticate me correctly. Very cool stuff. Great ways to access our system.
Now, Daniel, is there any kind of nice little nibbles of or nuggets of information that we need just to make sure we have our at least base familiarity with Linux, or are we ready to keep on rocking?
Yeah, just a couple other things real quick, and then we'll call this an episode, is just be aware of some of the standard users you might run into. Root being the power user, the almighty system administrator that can do anything and everything they want, right? Root. Then you have your standard users, something like what you saw on Prod 1, where I just had the D. Lowry account. I'm able to do whatever I can do, which is typically locked down when it comes to administrative functionality. But then I also used a thing called sudo, which is a sudo user, which is basically giving you access to more administrative functionality, which you can set inside of the etc sudoers file if you're inside of a Debian system. I think it's called the wheel group inside of Red Hat-based systems. But so those are the 2 things you might want to be aware of. We did talk about service accounts a little bit, which are meant to run services for you, something like Apache. But there you go, Justin. That is permissions and basics when it comes to securing Linux.
All right. Well, I feel a little more prepared to continue on, and hopefully you do as well. So join us on back. But for this one, we're going to go ahead and call it done. So signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Justin Dennison.
I'm Daniel Lowry.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.